And I would kindly ask you to keep your phones on mute, and also generally the cameras off while we have presenters. This is the second LAV of a series of exchanges between South Africa and Latin America. The first LAV was around the immediate responses to COVID and the role of community-based and social organizations. And this LAV is focused on the Kosovo Upgrading Project. The session will have two main parts. The first part will be presentations. We'll have a presentation from the Kosovo project, and then snapshots from cities projects, and then we'll have an open debate. For the open debate, we have the active participants confirmed on the program. So I forgot to introduce myself. I am Ana Claudia Rosba. I am the regional manager for the Cities Alliance in Latin America. And I will partially moderate the event. To start, I would like to invite Deputy Director General from the Department of Human Settlements in South Africa, Amedi Wada, for the welcome remarks. Amedi?
Hi and welcome everybody to the second LAV. I must begin with an apology from the acting DG and Mr. Cheney, who are in a ministerial meeting, which was called at the last minute and yesterday, and so apologized and sent their apologies. This second LAV is one of a series. The LAV 1 set the scene, and LAV 2 is through a lens of informal settlement upgrading, somewhere between Habitat 3 and COVID-19, and COVID-19 occurring as a rapidly societal change that impacts the vulnerable disproportionately, and hence the discussion. We must say that LAV 2 is through a tremendous collective effort of a number of participants, which have been mentioned and coordinated by Cities Alliance, and we must thank all of them for doing that. But the principal point that's made through the efforts of this group of people is that we know that it's the vulnerable are most disproportionately impacted, and it's within an era of an emerging practice that's bottom up by citizens and residents and their organizations that support them, those in this room. And it is the citizens through their own agency that secure in their attempts to secure life that have shaped the cities we live in, but more importantly, the cities that we wish to live in. As per the concept notes, the larger trajectory of upgrading and the robustness of financial and planning frameworks in many countries in Latin America, combined with recent responses to COVID-19, might be useful for South African policymakers, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders as they consider the strategy and tactics to pursue and realize appropriate approaches. The key issue is that solidarity in COVID-19 is the currency of exchange. And it is on that basis that we look at the strategies and tactics for local government as a whole, and civil society organizations to engage in support for the appropriate short-medium approach to informal settlements. It's experiential, and that's the purpose. In the framework for discussions, we're going to focus on the Kosovo projects, and that I will not repeat, and that has been circulated. And in concluding, the framing of that is based on four structuring elements: the financial framework, the social function of land densities and settlements in COVID-19, governance, and the institutional arrangements, and ultimately the currency of social solidarity. So welcome everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Amedy. Just for clarification, the LAVs, or the housing laboratories, and from Spanish LAV, Laboratorios de Vivienda, they have been implemented in coordination with a wide range of stakeholders in Latin America, the Urban Housing Practitioners Hub, the Lincoln Institute is also a strong supporter and also a co-organizer of this LAV that I forgot to mention. Sorry, Enrique. And this is horizontal peer-to-peer exchange and demand-driven. No, it's basically technical assistance on demand through practitioners to very specific needs in terms of programs, projects, and policies on housing and habitat matters. So I will now hand over to Mark Napier, who will moderate the first part of the laboratory. Mark?
Thank you, Ana Claudia, and good afternoon to everybody. It's Mark Napier here from Pretoria, and yeah, by way of introduction, just an architect and working in the housing and land spheres. So in this part of the program, we've got a number of speakers. Firstly, the main case study is the Kosovo Upgrading Project, and that will be presented by Luyanda Mpatlwa, who's an architect and has been appointed on this project to look at the upgrading of the settlement. He studied also in Berlin, Germany, and returned to South Africa in 2000, and he's currently the president of the South African Institute of Architects. His studio is in Cape Town, and it's called Design Space Africa. So that's Luyanda, and then after Luyanda, we'll go to some short inputs from cities, firstly from eThekwini or Durban, and then Johannesburg, and then at the end of the presentation session, we'll go to Bogota. So I'll introduce the speakers as we go, and we'll leave the discussion to the end of the presentations, and that's when Ana Claudia will take over again. So thank you everybody for all your efforts, and I'd like to hand over now to Luyanda, who can share his screen with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just first up, thank you, Mark, for the intro. But first up, perhaps, just to say that this is a presentation that is essentially from the client, Department of Government, and they're represented by Pilar Marcela, who is the Chief Director. She's going to be speaking to particularly the policy side of things and the institutional arrangements from government. Then we also have Gita Govan, who were the planners appointed for this project. But Gita herself, an established architect and urban design consultant in Cape Town, and academic, has been working on Kosovo for more than 30 years. So they are part of the presentation, and we've slotted ourselves according to the various roles that we believe we play on the project. So I am the lead person, but I am part of the team. I'd like to share the screen. And in so saying, say that don't be scared that maybe there are a lot of slides. We have prepared very, very precisely how much time we're going to spend and deal with the key issues. And the longest presentation has been submitted to everyone, so we'll just have highlights. So I'll first hand over to Pilar, who is going to be talking to the areas around policy and around institutional arrangements. Pilar?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, from a very cold Cape Town. As Leander has said, we've split ourselves. I think there's a bad echo. Are you good? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we're good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vila.
All right. As Leander has said, we will split the presentation between the three of us. I'll deal with the first part. Starting us off, I didn't want to assume that everybody understands. So I thought a minute just sharing on that. Within 4 million, and it is the second most populous city after Johannesburg. Cape Town has got this very interesting dichotomy in that it has been named as the best place to visit in the world by the New York Times and the Daily Telegraph. However, as the locals would say it, on the other side of the mountain, you begin to see a different picture. Yeah, and then the thing will stop presenting.
Yeah. I'm just going to change that.
We're having problems with internet. Please excuse. We do apologize for that.
We can see the screen, Vila. Pilo, we can't hear you. Is it possible, Loyanda, do you want to go ahead and present? There seems to be an issue with the difference between the presenter and the speaker, the screen presenter and the speaker. Loyanda, do you want to just respond?
I don't think Leander had the question. If you perhaps don't mind repeating that.
Pilo, we can hear you now. So if you want to carry on speaking, you can just, you'd cut for the last 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, we can see the screen, but we can't hear you, Pilo. Okay. Anna Claudia, do you want to suggest how to proceed? Should we take a different case study?
Yeah, I would say we go to the city snapshot, no, because I see, yeah, Luyanda.
We've lost all connection.
We dropped, we lost everybody, unless Gita is there and want to share some information.
Gita, are you still
I'm
there?
here.
Do you want to share some information in the meantime
Gita's
until we
here.
get Luyanda back?
Somebody needs to let Luyanda in, he says.
We have let him in.
Yeah. So.
Yes, we're back.
He's back.
Ah, good. Okay.
Okay.
So let's try it.
There seems to be some conflict with speaking and presenting from different machines. I don't know how you want to proceed.
Leander and Pilar, maybe switch off one computer and run only one.
We've done that.
Okay. The screen's on, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I was just explaining the interesting dichotomy of Cape Town, where on the one side of the mountain, you've got this best picture, and whereas on the other side, you are faced and confronted with high levels of inequality, major challenges pertaining to poverty, unemployment, and health-related issues around AIDS and TB, and with the highest rates, TB rates linked to poor housing. And in terms of the housing need, the General Household Survey of 2018 basically indicates that about 17% of the people are living in informal housing. And when we dissect that even further, of that 220 people on our housing demand database have indicated that they are either living in informal dwellings, being in the informal settlements, or in backyard shacks. And this number keeps growing every year. There's notwithstanding the number of houses and opportunities that we build. Okay, just also very, very briefly to just explain that Cape Town is still reeling from your apartheid legacy, where, as can be seen on the map on the left, that 80% of the well-located land is still vexed on with the minority depicted in blue on that map, and obviously the areas depicted in green is your majority of the people, and it's further away from the city center. And we're still trying even today to navigate this space to see how we can ensure integration within that context. Like any other informal settlements within the country, these areas are most vulnerable in terms of fires and flooding in winter. We have flooding, and in summers we have fires, and it leaves devastation in its way. We've had to, as a sector, come to a reality check that informal settlements upgrading and informal settlements are here to stay, and we therefore need to make sure that we prioritize them. Everybody would recall that when we started out, especially within the South African context, we were talking about this notion of eradicating informal settlements or slums, but we had to soon reset, because the reality set in that these informal settlements are here to stay, and we needed to find strategies to deal with in situ upgrading of these informal settlements. In terms of the policy framework, we've got a number of policies that we have that basically underpins and informs what we do. At the top is the Constitution, which talks to everybody having a right to adequate housing, and the state needing to make sure that we put measures in place to ensure the progressive realization of this right. And all the way down to your sustainable development goals. This list is not exhaustive in any way or form, but it does inform basically everything that we do within the space. What has since happened is that at national level, working together with provinces and other partners, there was a need for us to just revisit some of the policies. As we were implementing certain programs, we realized that we needed to change and shift gear to respond to what we were experiencing on the ground. So basically that slide talks to some of those changes in the policy landscape. And I think during the Q&A session, Amity can talk more on the policy shift because that is primarily driven by national government. The housing code provides different housing programs. There's, I think, a total of about 22, but within the Western Cape, we're focusing primarily on just the 16 housing programs. And on the left, you will see I'm touching then on the financial frameworks that at the national level, we've got a subsidy quantum that is set and the National Department provides and gives directions in terms of the limits of this funding. And each of those programs that you see on the left has got its set funding limits, and the way the funding flows, national would then give the funding to provincial departments, and then we in turn, working very closely with the local authorities and other agencies, we would then disperse the funding to develop housing opportunities responding to informal settlements upgrading or be it a greenfield development. The challenge with this approach is that 90% of what we do comes from government grants. And the question, this begs the questions of sustainability, especially when we're looking at the challenges that we're facing now with COVID and the shrinking financial resources. How do we then begin to make sure we optimize the funding envelope that we have to and respond to the need that's growing by the day? Just moving very, very swiftly on Kosovo itself, I think as you would have read in the documentation that we sent, this forms part of a Southern Corridor program. We decided, I think it was in 2015, as the provincial department working very closely with national, that let's adopt a programmatic approach in informal settlements upgrading. And we identified some 7 mega informal settlements along the transport corridors of Cape Town. And one of those settlements is Kosovo. And at the core of this, and our objective was to really promote an integrated approach to informal settlement upgrading, not only focusing on the issues of basic services, but looking at socioeconomic connectivity issues as well. That just gives a context of where Kosovo is in relation to the major transport routes. Very briefly, in starting out this process, we realized that it is a very massive task, and it was important for us to take some lessons from the past projects that we've experienced to guide us going forward on how best to deal with this upgrading program. And we had about 6 pillars that we looked at in terms of the development process. Firstly, we said we need to frame the project as I've indicated. And secondly, we as government, as Western Cape government, we acknowledge that we need to make sure that we pool the different skill sets to assist us in this. In the past, we would have just appointed only few professionals, but in this instance, we saw the need to bring in other professionals like the architects, urban designers, development economists, community facilitators to just help us unpack this whole upgrading process. And with that, with the limitations in terms of the subsidy model and the limits as set out by national government. We also, central to this whole upgrading process was the need for community profiling and the need for us to ensure that we've got credible data that would then inform our upgrading interventions. And we made use of an NGO community resource center to assist us with that. Even there, we were faced with some limitations in terms of funding because the funding sits in different programs. So we had to find a creative way to make sure that we pull all of this together. I've touched on the issue around the funding limitations there. As you see, another key point that we've had to grapple with was this whole issue of relocation and de-densification. There is a school of thought that says that there is no need to de-densify and relocate people, but when you're dealing with high densities, we were faced with a situation to actually identify additional land to ensure that we can go in and begin the in-situ upgrading process. And linked to that, as I've already alluded previously, we faced with emergencies on a yearly basis, whether it be fire and flooding. What should then be our response in that regard? So it was important for us to say, whilst we're looking at a long-term view, what is it that is required in the short term to respond to some of these emergencies? And again, then we were faced with the limitations around funding. On the issue of institutional arrangements, next slide please, it's a very complex process, and this slide, what it sets out is that we do have implementation protocols with the different agencies that we work with, both at an intergovernmental level, but also at a project level. And I think if when you get time, you will, and you can see we've captured and we've brought everybody that we've worked with. It's not set in stone. As we see the need to bring new voices into the picture, we incorporate them into the process. But most importantly, we've set out a structure to ensure that the community has a voice at a ward level. And all of this rolls up to a superstructure where each ward is represented by the community leader, and all decisions that are made pertaining to the approach and some of the upgrading principles are then taken at that level and fed back to the community by their respective community leaders and councillors. Very quickly on the just Kosovo profile, the people settled in Kosovo 21 years ago. We're talking about 6,500 households, and the population is estimated at about 14,000. And the challenge is there, it's high density, the land for decanting, and the need to address emergency housing due to fire and flooding. Whilst we still had a long-term view of providing a permanent solution, we had to put strategies in place to respond to the emergencies that we were faced with. And as the data that we collected, they showed that the services that are provided there in Kosovo are way below the national norm and standard. For every 139 families, for example, in Kosovo, we found at the time were sharing a standpipe, and 31 families were sharing one toilet, whereas the norm is 1:5 and 1:25 respectively. So again, we had to move in whilst we're in the process of designing this whole upgrading project. We had to deal with those real issues that people were facing on the ground at the time. Next slide. This just shows again that the extent to which we went in collating the data to inform the interventions are both at a short, medium, and long term. I think I will then hand over to Luyanda to take us through the design process.
Okay, apologies for the minor hiccup. I hope we can catch up on that. On my side, the real issue is okay. I presented last week, and I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on this because we've got a presentation that Gita is going to make, which could not be made last week. So I'm going to fly through these because I think it's important that we just contextualize the location of the site, which is a 28 hectare site, and which is made up of different parcels of land. The blue owned by the city, the gray owned by the railway entity, which is also in the proximity of the station, and the green is owned by Public Works Department, and it is actually being used by the police college, which is next door. So one of the things that we've developed as architects and urban designers was to realize that there is actually a strategy we need to have in order to do an informal settlement upgrading. And that started with the identification of the community involving NGOs like Slum Dwellers International and Cork in the case of South Africa, to collect the data and to have a profile of the people. And then devise an upgrading strategy, which the government has come up with, as Pilar has outlined, and actually develop.
Hi, Mark. I believe it's not working.
Yes, we seem to have lost the Cape Town group again. I'm wondering if we shouldn't just carry on with the Durban group, although I see Durban's also had a power failure. So we're having, please ask forgiveness from everybody.
Yeah, I'm back in.
Gita is still on.
Gita, I don't know if you want to wrap up because we're already quite far over time for this session.
Sure.
And we've lost the other two again, I think.
Yeah, sure. I can wrap up. What I want to do is, here, Leander's on the phone. Hello? Guys?
From your side, Leander's internet is giving problems.
Yeah, I'm connecting, and maybe I can just quickly wrap up. We're out of the time anyway. Okay. So
go to your part and then
shall I do that?
Just share the slide.
Okay. Folks, can you hear me?
Yes, we're good. Thanks, Gita.
Okay, so I need to share the screen, and
you can see the screen.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, just blow it up onto slideshow if you want to, but it's very clear.
Okay, brilliant. There we go.
Thanks.
All right, so I think if Leander comes back on, we'll quickly run through his stuff. But essentially what he's done is he's worked with the underlying structure of the layout of Kosovo and worked within that in terms of both medium density and lower density housing solutions. That's been interacted with the community, and so they've been brought into the picture. There's levels of happiness and unhappiness around that, but essentially it begins to target a reasonable density. The slide that's on the screen at the moment is part of our analysis, where right from the outset we'd indicated that additional land would need to be found. And then against that, we also then argued that seeing that more than 40% of the people, of the households are in fact not qualifiers for subsidies, that we rethink the service sites that non-qualifiers would normally get. And we actually stack everybody up between 3 and 4 stories high because of the land shortage. So the second panel is showing that. And then we said the key resources that people have then are what we target as livelihood strategies. So my focus today is about the livelihood strategies in the Vusi project, which is a greenfield site that we have developed for decanting from Kosovo. And there we're looking at providing 40 square meters as subsidized housing. But because we're stacking people up and saving on all of the other costs, you can in addition provide a module which is virtually for free, which then the primary householder can rent. So with one subsidy, you're providing 2 opportunities, and you're providing an income that helps to pay for other costs. There's rooftop farming, 19 hectare site allows for 5 hectares worth of rooftop farming, and that generates a surplus of in the region of 1,000 rands per household per month, which can also cross-subsidize some of the other costs, energy, rates, taxes, management, etc. There's rooftop PV, there's an agri-hub which is making use of existing buildings on the site, water resilience, waste reuse. 30% of the waste is organic and is tied into the food production system. And then we've designed the urban design in such a way that there are 5 tiers of local economic activity on the site, so that local goods and services and the everyday spend of people is actually contained on the site. In addition to that, we had the discussion with the department that the accommodation potentially could be structured so that a small percentage of it could be gap housing, because with 2,800 households, you're looking at over 7,000 people, which would warrant a primary school and a high school. And that could be structured around shared facilities, and you could surround that with gap housing for key worker housing so that you bring in the aspect of integration. So this is what the layout of Vusi then looks like. The green is the servitude, Eskom servitude, where the waste gets converted into seedlings. The entire layout, the access road is to the left over there. The blue buildings are the primary and high school with the club facility. And then you'll see that dotted around the central space are a series of little village precincts. Each of them is approximately 500 households at a time. The green roofs are 3-story, the yellow buildings are 5-story, and the red buildings are also 3-story with local shopping at the lower levels. So the idea then is that you have a series of these little neighborhood precincts where people begin to recognize each other. The red buildings hug a level of formal and informal activity at 500 households at a time. That's the local economic opportunities. The roofs are all producing energy and food, and they're also helping with the recycling of the water. We're sitting above an aquifer, so we can reduce the water footprint to about 40%, water, and the rest comes from elsewhere. The yellow blobs to the left are existing sheds, which can be repurposed for urban agriculture that is connected to the Philippi horticultural area, where 60% of the vegetable needs of the city of Cape Town is produced, sent to Epping. 30% of that is wasted in the process, comes back to these communities in a deteriorated state. So this will become basically a stopover session. The interesting thing about the Vusi project is that the land is supposedly held in trust by a local community, of which there are 800 households. And so this would be a project that would be partnered with provincial government. I'm going to go through this very rapidly. We've used all the urban design structuring of any normal settlement to make it normalized into the future. And the key point about this is that each of the precincts, the village precincts, is then structured as a governance precinct. And the rules for that governance can be structured with regard to the typology of the precinct. So 1 to 7 are residential, 8 is the agribusiness facility, 9 is commercial retail with your line shops, etc. 10 is education. And the levies and the income, the surplus income from the PVs on the roof and from the food gardens, which are structured as proper businesses with shares for the communities, that would be paid out directly in the forms of the levies that need to be coordinated, and provide the training so that each of the blocks can actually have proper management, training, conflict resolution, etc., etc. This is now the layers of the economic web that belongs to the community. The bigger pieces clearly would be commercially operated. And then we've also distributed the water recharge and management facility SUD system together with the tree system. And this also in itself generates a level of income because it's a high degree of urban forestry that could be productive as well. This is just showing the key kind of components of the different water and energy and food systems. These are the collection points for waste. There are communal laundries so that the water from all the grey water can be treated and utilized for the communal laundries. And with the PV guys, I managed to persuade South North to assist us to do the energy study on an independent basis. And we worked out that we could use a telephone app system to generate credits and incentivize people to collect the waste, use the collective communal laundries, and If they logged certain data, then we would be able to collect that data and make that available to understand the kind of behaviors that are going on in the community. So these are all in theory, because in fact, there's no mechanism to implement these, and funding would have to be raised to make that work. These are some of the typologies of the housing. The gaps that you see in the middle come from the Elemental project in Chile, but we now are stacking that up on a multi-story basis. On the right, you have micro apartments. We ran the numbers and we found that by building in this way, on the BNG spend, if you disconnect it from the individual person, you would actually land up with a surplus. And on the micro apartments, you'd run a short deficit. And the 3-story, you would get a smaller surplus. But altogether, that would in itself generate a surplus, which would allow you to invest in the making of the public spaces, as well as the additional accommodation that then creates a secondary ownership at a local level. And that's just some of the cost structuring. All of these slides are not in the slide pack that we've shared. I just pulled this up quickly because that's what we had available. But it shows you that the governance stuff could be addressed quite closely. And we talked with a number of agencies around how the governance could work. The PV slides, I'm happy to reshare these slides as well, shows the kind of profit per year that could be generated on the basis of market capital. And then just the fact that you're dealing with between 7,000 and 9,000 people with the additional secondary rental stuff, you begin to create a local economy that is quite robust and can operate at 3 or 4 or 5 tiers of economy. And this, we didn't have the budget to do the water study. I was hoping to raise that independently, but what we showed here is that we would use 30 liters of a 75 liter per person allocation from the grid. 25 liters would be from the borehole, which we would then recycle into the toilet flushing and the laundries. So in fact, you would reduce your water demand from the grid to 30%. And the final end product could be recharged into the aquifer. I'll stop there. So that's essentially how we've gone about thinking of the greenfields development, whereas what Luyanda is dealing with is the in-situ development of the existing brownfield site, which has greater complexity to deal with.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Gita and Luyanda and Pila. I'm sorry we chopped in the middle there. I think there was some internet connection problems.
Sorry, I just have a message from Pila.
Yes.
Pila has some slides that she needs to present. I can attempt to pull them up, or if you can see if they are able to reconnect. I think it's quite important because
we need to get onto the Durban and the Joburg case studies as well. So just if you have them handy.
If you give me a moment, I will pull it up.
Thank you.
It's just opening. There we go. I'm going to see if I can get Pila on the cell phone.
I am here, Gita.
Oh, brilliant, Pila. Can you talk? I'll advance the slides as you need.
Please go to the COVID slide, I think, so that I'll spend 2 minutes and just on the recommendations. I do apologize for our internet.
Okay. Gita and Pila, is Luyanda also going to present, or will this be the last ones?
I think this will be just the last one. We're just mindful of time, and then we can just engage on the Q&A in terms of his design principles on upgrading approach.
Great, thank you.
Pila.
Gita, please share the COVID, the main slides on the COVID response.
Here's the COVID slide.
So very quickly, so there was also a request for us to show how we're responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as the provincial government, what we've done, we adopted a whole of government approach and a whole of society approach that looked at what each of the different departments can do. You will see there's about 6 thematic areas there, and each provincial department slots in one of these thematic areas. For us as a human settlements, ours is within the slowing the spread thematic area. Next slide, Peter. So in response to slowing the spread, we adopted two approaches. One was to improve the water provision as well as the sanitation. And we have then gone in and installed water tanks. But the challenge, particularly within Kosovo, because of high densities, we could not go and put these 5,000 liter tanks because there was just no space. So we've had to then resort to bringing in and trucking and cutting the water in, which also just adds to the cost, which then brings me back to my initial thoughts on that. In any upgrading process, the issue of relocation is inevitable because we could not even go in to provide water points to ensure that people have got access to that. Another way in which we are responding to COVID, next slide, Gita, is around the establishment of what we refer to as a transitional areas or de-densification program. We're wanting to move away from the old way of doing things as depicted in the picture on the left, and we are proposing a multi-story type units using alternative building technology that's not using your brick and mortar. We're saying let's now venture out and look at developing these TRA areas with obviously with a view that these are going to be there for a long term. How do we then create these spaces to ensure that we uplift the communities and improve just the quality of life in general? Next slide, Kitten. Next slide, that just talks to the design. Some of the benefits, I think we'll share this slide. What we found is that if we go the traditional transitional area, it's still very costly in terms of the operation and maintenance. And what we do here is we provide the ablution facilities within each 24 square meter unit. And it allows us as well to modify the units because it's modular in form, to modify the units later on to fit into one of the programs that are alluded to earlier on so that we can then hand it over to that qualifying family, which would also improve the issues of tenure. Next slide, Ketan. I think just go to the recommendations slide. That just shows what we're wanting to do and the specifications and the sustainable building technologies that we want to do. There, we've already started piloting some of these things because one thing that this COVID has indicated to us as a sector is that we will not be able to build houses in the conventional way. So we do need to explore alternative building system to stretch the rent, as it were, for the lack of a better terminology. So in closing, there are key things or recommendations that we want to put forward. One is this whole notion of bringing together the funding instruments. As I alluded to earlier, you've got all these 22 different programs, each with its own funding mechanism. And you'll find that the emergency housing program allows you to build the top structure, but it does not allow you to build the subterranean infrastructure. You would have to go and tap into that funding from a different source. So we're saying there is a need for us at a national level to have this conversation around bringing together the funding instruments and pooling the resources to make sure that we're effective in what we do. Secondly, linked to that is the whole issue of reviewing the norms and standards. Currently, the national code says that we have to provide a 40 square meter unit, but in some of these informal settlements, we find that it's single-headed household, it's only a bachelor. So why should we provide a 40 square? Why can't we adopt a studio unit and streamline that and make it as included in the policy so that we can respond better, and also make sure that we uplift the issue of rental tenure situation within the informal space. So those are the issues that I think requires further refinement at a national level to enable us to do some things that we're wanting to do within this upgrading program. I think I will leave it there, Mark, because great. I know we've gone way over time. Apologies for that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to all of you for that. A lot of detail, and I think some of these recommendations that we're coming out at the end will start to be reflected by others as well. So I'm going to move on to eThekwini, which is Faisal Sidat and Mark Misselhorn. Faisal being the senior manager at the eThekwini Municipality's Human Settlements Unit, and he's also a chair of the city's Incremental Upgrading Forum. And then just to introduce Mark Misselhorn as well, who's the CEO of the Project Preparation Trust, who works in partnership with a lot of stakeholders, including the city, to put projects together on informal settlement upgrading. Brilliant. I'll hand over to Faisal and to Mark. Thank you. You've got 10 minutes between you, if that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we're good.
Yes. Okay, great. So 5 minutes. So I'm not very familiar with, or too familiar with Zoom, and hence Mark is assisting me with this. I'm more of a MS Teams user. But thanks for the opportunity, everyone. So very quickly, eThekwini has, I think, perhaps the highest number of informal settlements, I think, than other cities. Over 580, comprising 287,000 households, makes a bulk of our population, and it's going to take us many, many years to overcome that backlog, given the number of subsidies that we receive annually from national. We also have, unlike some cities, challenging topography, and also many settlements in environmentally sensitive areas. We have over 100 settlements which comprise over 1,000 households. The good thing is that 77% of our households are in a category B1, which you call this development category, which is settlements that we've been earmarking for incremental in-situ upgrade with essential services. Many are also pretty dense, over 200 dwelling units per hectare. And what's significant is the city has taken a decision, in principle decision, to have or to reduce the relocation of informal settlements. So by and large, we try and upgrade where we can, and hence less than 3% of our households have been earmarked for relocation, and that's mainly due to sites being unsafe for habitation. Mark, the next slide. So the city has embraced the new approach to upgrading. It has for quite some time. I mean, just looking at the sheer magnitude of the challenge that we had to act speedily, and it wasn't business as usual. There's a realization that the conventional housing subsidy program isn't going to be sustainable. Hence, the new approach, which needs to be inclusive, citywide, incremental, has to be in situ, partnership-based, participative, programmatic, differentiated, and flexible. And basically, the new approach not just looks at basic services, it also begins to look at things like early childhood development, basic education, clinics, providing tenure recognition, and how people can improve their own homes, and basically take a view of relying less and less on the state. Mark, next one. So in terms of the city's delivery to date, we've, in terms of the sanitation blocks that the city has provided in over 370 settlements. So well over 1,500 units have been provided. Many of our settlements have been electrified, some of them partially, and we are going back to extend that service to those that haven't been electrified. Water supply is provided to many settlements via the ablution blocks. They have previously been provided by water standpipes, and we have a new program of providing roads, footpaths, and stormwater controls, which we've done to over 40 settlements in the city. Next one, Mark. So our incremental services program has been largely informed by a housing spatial prioritization model, a GIS-based model, that provided information on bulk services, on public transport, employment, etc. So a number of factors were used in that model. What we've done is we're now looking at a revised model, focusing more on vulnerability, services deficit, population coverage, amongst others. The current package of services include the communal ablution blocks, waste removal, emergency access, the roads and footpaths with stormwater controls, electricity, and the new programs have been the early childhood development interventions and informal business support centers as well. So the city is taking a stance of not evicting people on settlements that have been established. There's a collective safety from eviction and the right to benefit from informal upgrading processes. Land isn't quite up front and is not a prerequisite that delays the project. And we've got legal opinion on this aspect. The incremental services has allowed us to prioritize the rapid delivery of services to an extent that we could get 10 to 15 households serviced as opposed to just one household benefiting from a service and a house. We've managed to negotiate with our engineers on acceptable standards. Layouts remain the same throughout the length of the project. We've tried to avoid abortive cost, and there have been various employment opportunities created via this program. Next one, Mark.
Sorry, Faisal, it's just glitched.
Oh.
See if it can, there we go.
Okay, so I'm nearly done. The progress, I'm not going to go through each one, but basically, in a nutshell, for example, the Durban's resilience strategy, which the city has been working on, has identified collaborative informal settlement action as a key strategic project. Linked to this, or arising out of this, has been a UKPF funded data gathering and integration project, which will result in an informal settlement information management system. What we realized is within the city itself, how are we dealing with information on informal settlements? And more importantly, how do we incorporate data from civil society and other stakeholders into our systems and even share that data? What's significant as well is that this data has been so critical or will be very critical in us being able to respond to challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. What's also important is the partnerships and the collaboration, whether it was through MOUs or the MOU that we've signed with the South African Shack Dwellers International Alliance, whether it was collaboration with the local university, UKZN, and the University of Westminster in London, whether it was the Casa Letu project, where we've had in partnership with the EU and with the Project Preparation Trust, or with private sector. What we realize is this is all critical for us to really ramp up and focus on incremental upgrading program. What's also critical is internally, we've gone a long way in creating an especially incremental upgrading forum, which talks to your transversal management. Next one, Mark. Mark. And this is my last slide, just to focus on the Casa Letu project, which begins to look at the capacity, the program. We're fortunate to have 10 pilots that we've identified, where implementation is currently happening. How can we learn and scale this up? We've actually managed to get all 10 pilots onto our UISP business plan. So funding is a certainty. We've got upgrading plans. We've got the necessary resources and capacity. For example, area coordinators for these 10 pilots. We're looking at new alternative densified typologies. We had 3 pilots from the 10. that we're part of the COVID-19 de-densification initiative. There's been a number of household surveys and structure mapping undertaken. So a lot of work has been undertaken on the incremental side. And just in closing, is that you've got to get the fundamentals right if you want to be prepared, for upscaling the program. And of course, as a city, we don't have all the answers, so we also still learning from others, and we're willing to do that with all the stakeholders going forward. Thanks, Mark.
Mark, do you want me to go straight in?
Yes, please. Brilliant. Thanks, Mark.
So, sorry, this PowerPoint glitches every now and again. It doesn't seem to like Zoom. So, as a sort of follow through natural continuity from what Faisal has set out, which is largely looking back at what's been achieved up to now. The topic that I'm talking about is how we optimize the type of upgrading response, this incremental upgrading response, scale it up and overcome and address various systemic barriers that are profound and quite deeply entrenched. There are good reasons why we have not seen the UISP implemented at scale and incremental upgrading taking hold at scale. So I'm going to touch on a couple of the key refinements to the approach, which have been made possible through the Kazalethu program. The first relates to how the services are provided to settlements. As Faisal's mentioned, there's a large number of settlements, 580 odd settlements. More than 3/4 of those are in situ upgrades. They're permanent settlements. They're never going to be relocated. And there's 240 odd thousand households. You're not going to deliver this with RDP housing, obviously, in the medium term, and probably never. But the historical approach to servicing has tended to be around the edge. I suppose the assumption was always it's temporary because we're going to be doing RDP housing quite soon. And it's been realized that quite soon isn't possible. And instead, the way that we go about providing services needs to be much more carefully thought through. Instead of the services being around the edge of the settlement, the services need to be located also inside the settlement. So the establishment of a services frame inside the settlement along the main access ways, which then breaks the settlement up into functional blocks, which can later be consolidated, becomes an obvious and very necessary intervention. And then along these access ways, water supply, mini communal ablutions, fire hose points, solid waste containment, as well as the electrical reticulation can be provided. What this does is it takes a much longer term view to incremental upgrading. And it's necessary because these B1 settlements, which constitute most of the settlements, are generally well located settlements. The problem they have is that they're dense and the sites aren't easy to develop, and there's a funding constraint in terms of accelerating formalization. So there's a compelling rationale to view these settlements as a viable target for serious investment in attention in terms of improving the services and reworking the urban form. So there's a potential for something better down the line. If this doesn't happen, then these settlements effectively remain locked, where there will be very little improvement. Fires are regular. The health and safety threats remain acute and substantially unmitigated. And the access to services, even though they may be better than nothing, are still around the edge and are not accessible, for example, to people at night needing to use an ablution facility. So the frame consists of a main service alignment. It does mean space needs to be opened up in the settlement. Generally, only about 10% of households, maybe 15, need to be relocated or moved, and some can be accommodated by reworking the space that's available, and some may need to be accommodated on adjacent land. And assumption is that people can then and will, if provided with support and functional tenure, consolidate and build for themselves, so that consolidation of the intra-blocks can occur over time, and possibly in time eventually individual connections. So the second refinement which goes with this is, what do you actually do about the housing typology? We have two extremes. We have very formal housing, RDP housing, BNG housing, catalytic housing, whether it's one-story housing, one site, one plot, or whether it's walk-ups. But it's formal, it's very costly, very slow pipeline of projects. And then you've got shacks on the other end, and there's nothing in between. So there, on these sites in Durban, they're steep. It's not possible anyway to go in and start doing civils. It destabilizes the slope. Conventional building with blocks and cutting platforms and creating retainings is generally not viable. But building with light structures is absolutely viable from a geotechnical point of view. So in collaboration with the HSRC and the city and as part of the KwaZulu program, we developed, have just finished developing and are now building demonstration units and about to roll out on 3 relocation sites this alternative typology, which you can hopefully see. And you can see some of the pictures of the work in progress, the inspection of the pile foundation and the superstructure, going up on the bottom left. This is mindful that land is very scarce and that there just is not enough land to accommodate everybody if one develops in a conventional way. And by building in this way and relaxing the side spaces, one can, treble the sort of densities one would get compared to conventional RDP housing, and also then be able to establish a way of building that people can do for themselves. So it makes use of materials that you can buy at your local hardware store. The units are built on site in a PHP type process by local artisans. There's a pile foundation, suspended floors. So the burden on the slope is minimal. And importantly, people can then build this in this sort of way for themselves without the state needing to be the supplier of housing indefinitely. So in these 3 relocation sites where 150 odd units are going to be built over the next 6 months or so as part of the COVID-19 program, they're reblocking pilots where those people who need to be moved out of the service lanes are being accommodated on adjacent land, making use of this typology, which obviously at this point falls outside of the existing NHBRC and building norms, but is nonetheless engineer certified, rational design, and a strong and durable unit, which is very fit for purpose. I think there needs to be a sort of opening up in our minds of what the urban form looks like in the future. This is this is a very rough preliminary sketch that one of our team did more than a year and a half ago. Soon we'll actually have something built that we can shoot from the air. But the idea is that this is how settlements can and should be consolidated over time by people in situ or with some government support, but augmenting the services provided by government and moving away from a program where government has to build all of the housing for people. So overall, in terms of optimization, aside from the 2 areas that I've mentioned, which relate to the services frame, getting the services in, and the alternative typology, these are some of the other areas where optimization is necessary with the eThekwini program. Faisal's touched on some of them. There's this more seamless cooperation between the line departments who used to working separately in providing services. There's the need for solving the issue of incremental land rights and planning arrangements, which we're making good progress with in terms of landowner notices, an incremental bylaw, incremental development zones, etc. And we need to have a solution for individual tenure eventually, because currently the tenure is non-individual through administrative recognition, but we need to start to put in place something like a municipal occupancy or tenure certificate. The various constraints with procurement and supply chain processes, which slow things down. And there's a need to increase the capacity and the participation in a scalable fashion. So in terms of the remaining barriers, and I think the suppliers, not just in Durban, I think there is still some residue of the need for a paradigm shift, where there is still a strong thinking at some levels that we're still going to solve the challenge of informal settlements with formal housing. And I think we know based on evidence that's not viable or possible, but we do slip back into that, and very often large chunks of budget still get used on that. And sometimes there's a resistance to upgrading in an incremental and alternative fashion. There are a range of statutory and regulatory inflexibilities which need to be overcome and will certainly require the involvement of the other spheres of government. I've noted them there. I'm not going to read them to you, but they're very important. They are starting to receive some attention. I think Amadi is very aware of these, and they're on the radar. There are challenges with funding. Brownfields incremental upgrading requires flexible, decentralized funding instruments for all sorts of reasons. You can read the detail or some of the points there, but municipalities do need the flexibility to move funding away from non-performing projects to adjust the scope and budget on projects as you get on the ground and adjustments become necessary. Procurement is very slow and clumsy. And the issue of having the capacity to achieve upgrading, including for the participation, as well as the ability to coordinate between departments and between spheres of government, is still quite a significant constraint. Partnership-based approaches, PHP, can help with things like participation, but the issue of better and more seamless collaboration between government and departments remains very key. Mark, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks so much to Faisal and to Mark for very detailed and graphically gripping presentation. I'm going to move on to the next speaker, but we just have to confirm his availability. It's Patrick Poppy, the Acting Executive Director for Housing for the City of Johannesburg. And I understand that he is available to present, so if he'll make himself known. There we go.
Hi, how's it?
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
I sent the presentation, I think it was on PDF, the challenge being that it was too big for me to email. I don't know whether you had sight of that. Let me try and see if I can share it. How do I touch this thing?
You should see the share screen at the bottom. If you hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen.
I saw the share screen, but I don't know. You know, technology sometimes.
Just if you hover your mouse pointer over the bottom, it comes up. Oh, it's an apple. Oh dear, dear.
Yeah, it's an apple. Oh dear, yeah. I had to connect the other way. Remember, I indicated that I've got challenges with Zoom.
Okay. Do you want me to bring up the PDF?
Can you please bring up the PDF?
And then will you just tell me which slides you want?
Yeah, sure. I'll go through, I think I've given you the background and a whole lot of other information, but I'll go through the information very quickly.
Okay. This one? Are we?
Yeah, that one.
Good. Okay.
All right, thank you. Can we move to the next slide? Good afternoon, everyone. The city is working in collaboration with the provincial department and the national Department of Human Settlements. And we've been assisted by Mr. Morema, and I think he's connected as well. I'm going to give a brief background around our informal settlements upgrading program, as well as what we are doing in terms of the COVID-19 interventions. Can we move to the next slide, please? I've indicated that we're working together with the spheres of government, so we can pass this slide. Can we move to the next one? These are just backgrounds in terms of ensuring that we give people security of tenure and making sure that they live in a healthy and a secure area, changing the living livelihood within their spaces, and ensuring that we partner with various stakeholders to ensure that we empower the communities and give them the better life and change their way of doing things. Can we move to the next one? This is just the process in terms of how we want to change our provision of services, as well as ensuring that you give people a different form of tenure, including electrification on the grid and off-grid, and provision of water and sanitation, which is permanent rather than the temporary solution, which has to be meant on a day-to-day basis. Can we move to the next one? We can skip this slide. I just need to indicate that at the time when we started with the National Department, when we undertook a study around 2017, they looked at a number of informal settlements within our area. And at the time we had 191, and we've worked on 118, and we've got upgrading plans, and we have identified 73 out of the 118 for us to be able to ensure that we deliver a better service. Can we move to the next slide? These are the areas that we're talking to, and they are spread within our regions. We've got 7 regions, region A to G. Let's move to the next slide. Most of the informal settlements that we have fall within the category B, B2, and C. Category A has got a few settlements. So one way or the other, the city has decided to look at the category B1, even though it's going to be a long-term solution where we need to buy land and make sure that we upgrade the areas. We're looking at 30 informal settlements within our next financial period to have finalized the upgrading plans and ready to upgrade the informal settlements. Can we move to the next slide, please? These are the settlements that we've identified, 30 of them. They're spread across the city. They're in 4 of the 7 regions, and would ensure that we uplift and change the living lives of those people in that space. Can we move to the next one? In terms of the current status, our number of settlements have grown to 260. As opposed to the 191 that I was talking to in 2017. So you can see that in-migration is a big problem for Joburg. And one or the other, we're looking at 168,000 households. What we've done is that we've made sure that the provision of water is increased. And in terms of the COVID-19, we've ensured that we deliver 1,392 additional toilets. And these toilets are cleaned 3 times in a week, as opposed to once or twice. And we've also delivered 1,081 additional tanks. We've got spaces around the city called hostels as well, where we've got 12 of these, where there's about 40,300 households, and we're doing the same in terms of ensuring that people are not affected or infected. Can we move to the next slide? We can skip this slide. Then what we've done is, based on the national mandate and the cabinet resolution, we've selected key areas or 3 of our informal settlements that are funded currently, and we've decided to put in TRAs. Can we move to the next slide? We can skip this slide. This is based on the background when the president pronounced. The same applies to this one. Can we move to the next slide? As I've indicated, that we've chosen 3 of the areas, one being Alexandra. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. In Alexandra, we have 43 informal settlements, but one settlement which is densely populated is called Stretla. And we have identified about 1,600 beneficiaries that will be relocating from this area into Marlborough sites, including other areas that are congested within Alex, to ensure that at least about 2,295 of our families are located in a better space. There's a hostel within the space as well. We are going to create new TRAs, about 1,233. Further to that, we've identified areas in Ravi Ridge, where we've got 2 plots that are owned by the city. We'll be de-densifying informal settlements to the tune of 1,100 families in that space. Can we move to the next slide? This slide also talks to one of the biggest settlement in Joburg called Zandspruit. We've got 701 stands in that area. We are now going to create about 2,000 units within that space, making sure that we de-densify the congested areas. And this would be a start because of the other portions that we are looking at formalizing and ensuring that people are relocated, and we de-densify the entire Zandspruit. And we are working with developers as well to create a permanent solution. So wherever we're going to move into the TRAs would be people who are qualifying, who are on the National Needs Registry, so that it's an easier process for us to relocate rather than having to start from zero. We just have to make sure that those people qualify, and it will give a perspective to use those TRAs in the future to de-densify areas within the spaces that we have or that are congested. And as I've indicated that we've got a budget. For instance, we've got 227 million that has been allocated for Madala and Marlborough Gardens for a construction of 3,528 units. And we've got additional funding for Alexander Extension 52 as well as Zandspruit to be able to finalize our process within a period of 4 months. Can we move to the next slide? The next slide talks to how are we going to create these TRAs. Can we move on to the next slide? We've identified these areas. Let's move to the next one. These areas have got approved layout plans, and that's how we're going to de-densify the people. In terms of the map, you can see that there are already stands that are created, the 701 stands. Can we move to the next slide? Can we cross this one? Let's move on. Let's move. Next. This is the area that we call one before this. Technology, thank you. This is extension 52, where I was indicating that it's an area that is readily available for development and it will be used for de-densification. Let's move to the next slide. Next, please. Next. These are just property descriptions. These are the 2 sites that have been identified in Marlborough, where the 2,295 units will be built. Can we move to the next slide so that we can show the, let's move to the next one. This is just showing progress in terms of the grading of the area. Can we move to the next one? Next. This is the sports field where there's a hostel. You see the diagonal shape there, that's a hostel. We're going to demolish that hostel. But before we demolish, we are going to create TRAs in the sports field. You can see an area behind the hostel. That's where we're going to de-densify and make sure that people are allocated in that space. But you'll see how the product looks like. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next. Okay, this is another area called Lufereng Development. We're doing 2,000 units to decongest 2,000 families within Soweto and an area called Protea South. Let's move to the next slide. We've got a developer appointed in this area. They've started already with foundations, as you can see the pictures. Can we move to the next slide? This is progress. You can see that wall plates are already being constructed. And by the end of August, we'd have 2,000 units ready for people to be relocated into the space. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. Next. Next. This is another area called Plot 323. We have been having 69 families living in tents since 2017. And this year we had to create temporary relocation units, and a donor gave us this units for us to be able to relocate those people into a space next to where they live. Can we move to the next slide? These are the tents, and you can see that we're grading the area. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. These are the units that were created for the families. They've now been relocated and they're happily living in those units. Can we move to the next slide? This is the old picture in terms of how their living conditions were, and this was not acceptable, and we had to change their livelihoods, and we've also electrified the units so that we ease their lives. Can we move to the next slide? As you can see that the old lady is happy and she's opening up her unit. There's one disabled person. We've provided a gas stove and a cylinder to ease their lives and to make sure that they're able to cook within their space. Can we move to the next slide, please? Next one. This is the area called Rabi Ridge Extension 2 and Extension 1. These are the land portions that I was talking to earlier in terms of the 1,100 units that will be constructed. Can we move to the next one? There's an area called Allendale. This is the future area where we're going to be relocating the families from TRAs and from the informal areas within the space. And this is going to give us at least 10,000 units, and we'll be able to de-densify a lot of congested areas in a region A, which is one of our areas around Ivory Park and Rabi Ridge. Next slide, please. This indicates the dwellings in terms of the scenario that we have looked at as a city to be able to get the 10,000 units between the scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. And scenario 3 seems to be viable, and that's the one that we're going to use. And we are going to decongest people that are living in a ESCOM servitude. Next slide, please. These are the cost implications in terms of how much we are going to invest in the space, and will take us up until the end of August. Next slide, please. Next one. Next. This is a container which is going to be used for the temporary relocation areas in areas like Madala, Hostel, as well as Marlborough sites. We're using containerized material, and the next slide will show how we're going to allocate them. You've got 3 bedrooms in one container that will be having another container that will be attached so that you create a living area for that one unit. So within a space of 2 containers, you'll be accommodating 3 families. Can we move to the next slide, please? Next slide, please, Mark. This shows the number of containers that we'll be using, and that will now be converted into family units. We've got various options, option 1 and option 2. But as you know, that the more you make available units in different typologies, you are going to lose space. And we are looking at a viable solution to accommodate as much as we can within the space. Can we move to the next slide, please? These are the containers, and this is how they're going to be stacked. We're going up 3 floors, and this would be able to create space and a better living condition for the people living there. Next slide. This is the final product, and it will have staircases. The original part that we decided upon was to have shared ablution facilities. We've now changed. Each unit would have its own ablution facilities, and that would also create a better habitable space rather than having people to share ablution facilities because of you might spread the COVID-19 pandemic within those areas that you've created as relocation areas. Next slide, please. This is how they are stacked, and this is how the staircases will look like. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Pilar. That was amazing. Just for our international audience, when we keep saying TRAs, I think some people have introduced it. It's temporary resettlement areas that have sort of come back quite a lot in the last few weeks with the response to the COVID virus. but essentially it's a way station on the, it's meant to be between informal settlements and longer term housing. But as some people have already said, they do tend to have a habit of staying longer. But yeah, we've heard about the policy frameworks. I'm going to move very quickly on then to our last speaker, Juan Felipe Pinilov, who's director at the JFP and Associates. He's also in the urban law and land management area, and he's coordinator of the legal and institutional component of the Phoenicia project. Juan, I'm assuming you're going to run the screen, but let's hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I will share my screen just to give you a brief context of the project. Then I have titled my presentation as take a look to the Phoenicia project as a participatory and sustainable urban redevelopment process, and that's what we'll be talking about to you. A presentation of the project and a brief introduction to its main features. Just very briefly, just to let you know where I am now and where is the project located. This is where Bogota is located in your left, right in the middle of the country of Colombia, up in the mountains. And to your right, you can see the location of the project within Bogota area, right in the middle in red. And closer we have this is the location of the project. It's in downtown Bogota, and it's the way it looks is like that. And I think that's a very particular case of urban redevelopment in Bogota, as I mentioned, in the city center. And it is particular because its promoter is not the city government nor a private developer. Its promoter is a very prestigious and well-known private university. The specific site is located right in the surroundings of its central campus in Bogota. It is also particular because it has been designed and it's being executed using relatively new planning and management tools for consolidated areas. We are using a partial plan and a land readjustment scheme that I will explain in some detail later. And finally, I think it's particular because of its innovative approach. It's a process of learning by doing and an open and transparent process of consultation, engagement, and negotiation of different and diverse stakeholders. This is the way the neighborhood and the site looks nowadays. As you can see, some pictures there of the current situation. It's old buildings, some of them in not that good shape, and many parking lots, and relatively low occupation of the people. Then that's the current situation. We have around 5,000 property units, around 1,700 residents, 550 property owners, and 45,000 built area. And the project, which is a partial plan, intends to transform that in those numbers that you can see there. The main goals of the project are to take advantage of a very good location. There is access to massive transportation system and public infrastructure with a current low density. As I mentioned, we have their population of lower and middle income families, diverse tenure situations. We have some informal tenure issues there. It's not the main characteristics, but we do have that in within the area. And the aim of the project is to make a 150,000 square meter redevelopment project within the area of the land, which is around 9 hectares, in which it's possible to combine social housing, replacement housing for current property owners, new areas for commercial and services purposes, new areas for the university, which is the promoter, as I mentioned, and new supply of housing for middle income families. And it's based on an integral approach. It combines social, real estate, urban, environment perspectives that make possible, which is one of the main goals of the project, which is do a redevelopment project without gentrification. How to ensure that the people who live there and is in the area nowadays could remain in the area once the project has been done. Then now I'm going to talk to you about the features that I want to point it out. I want to talk to you about why and how we have experienced that as a process, why it has been participatory, why we could say that that's a sustainable approach to doing redevelopment in a consolidated area of the city of Bogota, and how is the scheme of the urban redevelopment. Then let's see a little bit about the process. What I want to show you here, and don't really go into the detail of that. I just want to point out that this began with the designation of the area as an urban renewal area back in 2004, and it had a first effort of proposing a project that was refused back in 2007 to 2009, and until 2010 it turned in what we know nowadays as the Fenicia project, which is Progress Fenicia project. And that new approach began in 2010. And now you can see many of the main ethos of the project. But what I want to point out here is that from 2010, what we have been doing as a team for the construction and implementation of the proposal, and now in the implementation phase, is a process of trust building and stakeholders engagement. I just want to show you that because I think it's important to show how complex and time consuming is the innovation. It takes time, it implies back and forwards, but it is worth because it really integrates planning and design phase with the implementation phase and created, in this case, for this project, a well-established ground of legitimacy for it. And also, I want to point out how this process has shifted the way and sequence of the stakeholders' engagement. Only, as you can see there in the milestone, only after 5 years of the partial plan approval, there has been an official call for private developers to get involved. This is a private finance operation, and only 4 years after the approval of the project and 5 years of the beginning of the process, the developers were called. And it was like that because once the whole process of assembling the land has been proved that the community has sufficiently understand the scheme of the urban redevelopment and the rules and criteria for the participation of property owners and the city government has been well discussed and established, the project estimated that was the time for the investors and the big money to come. Now we are sure that under what conditions the private investors may get involved and what are the risks and benefits that stakeholders have to assume. And why participatory? It's been participatory. The urban proposal was built based on participatory roundtables and indirect interactions of technical teams with local residents, combining diverse techniques and methods. During the whole process, both on planning and implementation phases, there has been diverse means for exchange and participation among different stakeholders, public hearings, focus groups, negotiation roundtables, forums. But it has been contested. There has been conflict, tension, and that's also one of its main characteristics, the tension and how to deal with the tension. Part of the main activities that I have to do as a project legal advisor is to assist and get feedback of all those scenarios, including those of tension and conflict. During this process, I think I have gone through a master's degree on urban consultation and mediation. You can see here more meetings and events. We have been learning by doing on the process on how to communicate and how to engage with the different stakeholders. And as long as participation has to do with accessible information and telling stories of the project and of the people from the neighborhood, it implied, for example, to create a monthly project newspaper called Direct Fenicia or Directo Fenicia. You can see some of the covers in the image there. But as I mentioned, it implied a great effort of mediation and consultation. And based on those discussion and agreements during the formulation phase, we reached many agreements with the community in terms of what are the exchange methods and ratio, and I will explain a little bit later, how the project would guarantee to have housing and commerce replacement units, how the facilities cost won't increase when the project is finished. It implies for the replacement units to freeze the facility costs. And also it defined social programs during the process and after the project was approved, a whole set of social programs. And all those agreements are in the approval of the project, are part of the plan and are written and are rules now that we are applying. And those are the fundamental issues that establish incentives for landowners to contribute their land and to remain in the area once they get their contribution back. Let me do something here that I want to show you, and I see that it's covered. Let me see what happened here. I don't know, it's farther, sorry. We have this. Increasing housing density requires more and better public space in the project. Through the equitable distribution of burden and benefits, it would be possible to increase the public area designated to parks, plaza, public facilities, bike lanes, and sidewalks, reducing the current private area. For doing that, as shown in the graphic, it's absolutely necessary the land pool to make that shift in the area destination. The mixed use established a minimum of replacement housing units around 400 and social housing around 100, of a total of around 1,000 to 1,500 housing units. That mix allows to convert some of the estimated area of services and commerce into more housing also. How is the urban redevelopment process? This is the real change. How to overcome the land fragmentation. This typical size what you see there, that triangle is one of the blocks of the project. Typically around 1 hectare of area. It's divided in around 50 plots. To get the desired output requires to pull the land and to transform it according to the planning provisions. The scheme is to do the land pooling or land readjustment in 5 different stages of our urban action unit. It implies to define a framework to exchange current areas for the redeveloped built areas. That's the fragmentation of the area. Those are the 5. What you see on your right is the areas in which the redevelopment and the land readjustment will be done through those 5 areas. This is like the way it works. We have the current situation. We have to get the agreement with the landowners to be able to begin the redevelopment phase. We are close to begin that phase 1. We have invested many times in the phase 0 or the landowners agreement. Based on that land readjustment criteria, I just want to go very briefly through that. Those are the criteria, the rules for the land readjustment. Those were built and discussed with the people, and it took us almost a year to get to those criteria. And you have there the type of property currently, the exchange criteria, how to convert current areas into the new areas, and the exchange ratio that will be applied for that. That's going to be possible, and it took us many years to design that, around 5 years, to design the trust scheme that will support this implementation. It implies that we already have that matrix land trust. We have 5 subordinated land trusts that will do the readjustment for every one of those stages or urban action units. All of those mechanisms are already working, and we have above those land trust subordinated, we have those real estate trusts that will guarantee that the property owners will get their replacement units. And recently we have involved the developers that are on your right, sorry. That's just to end here. I will show like how the process can look. This is the first stage in which we are working now, and we have almost the whole land in the land trust for beginning of the works next year. This is the second stage, the third stage, the fourth, and after that we have the second stage. This is the building for the university, the one that just appeared there, and this is how it would look 10 years from now when it is all executed. The project has like a slogan, which is "Todos nos quedamos, todos nos movemos," which means we all stay, we all move. That's it, Mark. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Juan. And thanks to all of the presenters. It's been very, very valuable, and a lot of preparation has gone into that, and obviously years of work, and that's the important thing. I'm going to hand back to Ana Claudia now. We obviously slightly over programmed, so I'll hand back to Ana Claudia to just take us forward of how to do that. Thanks very much again to all of the presenters. It's hugely appreciated.
Sure. Thank you, Mark, for the facilitation. I also appreciate all the information. Yes, indeed, we are very delayed, but I see we still have 60 people on board. And for me, at least coming from Latin America, different context was very, very informative to understand the different contexts and approaches in the 3 cities. and also listen to what is perceived, as major bottlenecks. And they are very much related to the questions that we have put for debate on the concept note, elements of the financial framework, the social function of land, so issues related to the acquisition of land. I see different cities use different approaches on that, maximize existing infrastructure, the strategies for resettlement, reblocking, and replanning, and reviewing densities, and also the aspects of governance that were also incorporated into the presentations. So we were chatting here among the co-organizers, and we'll have less time for debate this time. So my proposal is that we spend around 20-25 minutes just listening to very, very key inputs from the active participants, and then 5 to 10 minutes to recap by David and Miriam. And we have to come back. There are several areas that were mentioned, and we'll come back for a more deep debate in the third session of this labs. Maybe I will start. Active participants, you can call me over chat, or you can raise your hand if you would like to make some comment. But I would like to start maybe with Carlton from Cork, because Cork was mentioned. Cork was part of the Kosovo project and did some enumerations. Carlton, are you there?
Yes, Anna Claudia, I'm here. Yes, thanks for the opportunity, and thank you so much for all the presenters. I think the presentation on the Kosovo project was particularly interesting for us because, as was mentioned, Cork and our community partners in the Federation and the Informal Settlement Network played a significant role in organizing the Kosovo community for their data collection process. This data collection process served as the basis for a lot of the planning that has gone ahead. I think you even heard Pilar mention specifically the issue of single person households, and our data, for example, revealed that in Kosovo, there was up to 33% of structures that only had one person living in it. That was quite significant when you start to think about what the planning is for the site moving forward. Currently, and maybe it's also worth saying that Cork and its partners weren't part of the planning processes related to the upgrading, which came after the data collection process. But what is very interesting for us is that we are also tied to this project because of the land that was mentioned called the Vusi site, which sits very close to the Kosovo land. And as Geeta mentioned, this land is actually owned and owned by community. And in our situation, it's owned by the Federation. And so the plans that Geeta spoke through, a lot of that has been part of a deeply participatory planning process by the Cork technical team, sitting with Federation members, mamas, looking at house design, looking at plot sizes, doing actual walkthroughs, plotting out space on the ground, helping people to understand what we're dealing with, because there was quite a big adjustment that needed to be made in people's mindsets. Why I'm sharing this is because the Vusi part of the project is actually over 20 years old. And it's got a long history. So when it came to this stage now, where we're starting to look at the opportunity to partner with province, one of the big things that we had to overcome was helping people to understand the change that was required around housing design, because you needed to think of density. And at the moment, all these mamas, when they started out 20 years ago, they were dreaming of a single-story house on a freestanding house on a plot. And currently we've gotten to the point where people are open to higher density, semi-detached, but all of this needs to be developed by keeping in mind the kinds of beneficiaries that you're dealing with. So that's, I wanted to share some of that just to add a little bit more insight into the overall project. I think also to understand that currently, as Kosovo keeps moving ahead, the leadership and the way it operates is to try and make sure that community members are continuously engaged in this planning processes moving forward. So I think what we understood as the Alliance in supporting this project, so CORC and Federation and ISN, is that the enumeration made clear that Kosovo, that site was never going to be enough to house all the people. And I think as Pilar and Gita explained, there was the need to look at additional sites. And what's very interesting for us now is that in the combination of the Vusi site, the actual Kosovo site, some transitional housing sites, we're going to have a combination of greenfield, in situ upgrading, as well as transitional housing. And there's a commercial site thrown into the mix as well, which Gita also mentioned in a presentation. So it's quite an amazing project. It's a combination of various factors, and it's going to require a lot of support. So yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Lauren from Citi. You raised your hand.
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation. This is the first time that Siri's participating, and we're glad to be here. Thank you. I wanted to just make a comment about temporary relocation areas and then make a comment about tenure security. Firstly, on the temporary relocation areas, I think we need to avoid temporary relocations altogether. Let's address relocation where it's a requirement in terms of an upgrading project. Our concern is that a relocation's focus, as we saw quite strongly in the Johannesburg presentation, the focus shifts to the greenfield site and it leaves the original informal settlement unattended to. In the process, it strips resources from the national upgrading program, and we're concerned about that. Also, in terms of our emergency housing program, any emergency interventions are envisaged as the first step towards realizing the right to housing. And I think that we need to bring that sentiment and that framework. Sorry, I've just been asked to start my video. I think we need to bring that sentiment and that framework to the COVID response. So I think the de-densification response is unfortunate because it shifts the focus to a greenfield site instead of dealing with both, with relocation where it's required in terms of an upgrading program. That's my one comment. My second comment is de-densification or decant, which is, and decant is a very unfortunate word, but de-densification is not the only way of dealing with overcrowded conditions. And I think we've gone down this avenue, unfortunately, in South Africa in relation to COVID. Secondly, just a couple of statements about tenure security and upgrading. I think it's really important that people already have rights. So the idea of giving people tenure and the focus on form, I think, is incorrect. The emphasis, we need a shift in emphasis to rather to recognizing the rights that people have and then improving them over time. So these rights are provided in terms of a Section 26 of the Constitution and in terms of the Prevention of Illegal Eviction of Land Act and Occupation of Land Act. So those rights currently exist. They need to be recorded, though, for them to become progressively more secure. So there's a lot more to be said, but in the interest of time, I'd like to just make a concluding point, which is that I really do think there's an opportunity now to take the functional tenure work that's been developed in eThekwini and Durban by the municipality and the Project Preparation Trust, the rights work that organizations like Siri and many others have been undertaking over many years, and the planning potential that we now have to declare informal settlement areas as incremental development zones, and putting in place guidelines for municipalities to be able to do this at scale. And Siri is interested in looking at how we could engage with the City of Johannesburg on this shift in approach and on an alternative strategy than the temporary relocation areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. You mentioned social function. I know, Margarita, you have your hands raised, but I will call Danielle Montandon first, just to address the social function, and then we come back. Danielle, are you there?
Yes. Thank you, Ana Cláudia, and everybody. So I have some approach, not exactly as a housing expert, but as a urban planner. And I think it's important to highlight some instruments that support housing projects and mainly to reserve land for that, to allocate urbanized land for that. So Felipe showed the project of Fenicia in Colombia. It is a kind of an instrument, partial plan, that but for this work it's necessary to have in the federal constitution a very structured legal system with instruments and planning framework, because for an example, to implement the equitable sharing costs of benefits. So in Brazil, we have an instrument, I think maybe Camila will talk about that, that's so-called special zones of social interest, and that it's defining the boundary. It's a kind of a zone, but it's obligatory to provide social housing in this area. And I think how it works in our system, it works because we have in the federal constitution and the national law the condition that the private property must fulfill its social function. So it is very important concept for us, because you define some restrictions for entrepreneurs in their development. For an example, if you want to implement to develop not low-income residential project, but high income, for an example, it's not allowed in this area. So I think it's important to highlight that, because Citizen Alliance supported a study that identified 11 national laws in Latin America that deal to the social function of the land. And there is a concept very important, that the individual interest must be subject to the collective interest. And I would like to highlight, for an example, the three main systems in Latin America is Colombia and Brazil. And we also have in Mexico national law in 2016, and also in Ecuador in the same year. And I think in Venezuela there is also another law, and other countries are implementing also, like Dominican Republic is developing a national law. So it's important to bring more, how can I say, legal security for all the process. So it's only some initial ideas. I don't know if Ana Cláudia, if I help, but is some initial things to our debate.
Sure, sure. Just quickly back to Juan Felipe. Juan Felipe, you are still there? Maybe you can just quickly clarify, yeah, on this front too, how Bogota dealt with this planning issues and yeah, the flexibilization of standards.
Yes, in fact, and thanks, Daniel, for the clarifications that I didn't really get into that detail, but we do have a planning system that allows to regulate a specific intervention, a project, that the scale of the Fenicia project, a redevelopment project, through a special tool of planning and management called partial plan. It really implies that that mechanism have the power to define how is going to be the project and how it has to be managed. In our case, in this specific case, this project defined not only how is going to look like the redeveloped area, but it defines the different set of rules that the different stakeholders have in their interaction in the project. One of the main innovations of this project is that we use that instrument as a, let's say, kind of a contract for the different stakeholders to have clear rules of involvement and engagement. But just to emphasize, this is a tool that we have in our planning system. The partial plan is a special planning and management tool that we are using in that way for this project. I hope it would add some clarification.
Thank you, Juan Felipe. Margarita, you want to come in?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Really happy to be here. I wanted to make a comment on a general comment on the South Africans, how they showed us what you're doing in the eradication of settlements, which I thought was extremely interesting. But I wanted to make a comment. I have quite a long experience in this. Many years ago, we started with that sort of programs. I am from Chile, sorry, from South America. And in the 80s. And in the 90s, I had the chance to evaluate these programs in Chile, that they were all backed up by the BID, by the Inter-American Development Bank. And then later on, I entered into the government and I did some incremental programs. And later on even, I did my PhD on this. So I started by doing the evaluation, and then I did the sort of hands-on part, and then I did the academic reflection on what had happened during these years. And one of the things that I have learned, and I still isn't so clear, is that although the housing, I am an architect, right, on first degree, but although I think the house is very important, but I think that a lot of thought and research and innovation is done on how to do the housing, but little is done on the urban design. And my idea is that the urban design here is vital. What I mean is that, for example, the way that, for example, the approach that in one of the projects that you showed, that you were doing a services that was sort of breaking in the whole settlement into blocks, which you named with numbers, I think it was. I think that is exactly the sort of approach. But what I didn't find, so why? Because you start making a hierarchy of roads that will then, I mean, the power of the people for self-building is enormous. Once you give the people the water, the legal rights, the electricity, the things that they cannot provide, they will surely do the rest. I mean, I know that. I've seen it done in many countries in South America. But what you cannot go against is the structure of the city. So what I mean is that that design of the roads is really important to get it right. So what happens is that if those roads really ingrain into the city structure, they will work. Why? Because you will have the traffic flow, commerce will emerge, people will start, being in the streets, they will take care of the gardens, and the community will rise because they will attract resources from the city in itself. They will integrate into the community, not only physically, but also socially and in economic terms. And that is really important to understand, because in one of, for example, the projects that I saw of you that looked very pretty, let's say, very, very well organized, but you were putting the center, the commerce centers for the minor units in the center. My experience is that that sort of commerce doesn't work. My experience, after seeing all this, is that a good public square is not good because it's well designed. it is good because it is well ingrained in the urban fabric. You cannot go against it. So for example, if instead of doing centralized urban commerces, you would put it in the roads, in the structural roads, that will provide secluded areas inside for the community to develop, but not strong barriers from one neighborhood to the other. Anna Claudia, yes, I will finish immediately. So I really think that's really important, because if not, what you do create are separated neighborhoods inside the same settlement, which is not so good. And lastly, I just want to finish by saying that the Colombian project is really, you know, it's fantastic how you're being able to ingrain the public, the private, and sort of the community. So my congratulations. I hope it goes very well. Sorry if I was too long.
Thank you, Margarita. Aji?
Thanks, from Development Action Group. Anna Claudia, thanks. Firstly, just to kind of congratulate the speakers on really excellent presentation. I think a lot of things are being pushed, which was the original intent of the incremental upgrading process in South Africa. Three very quick points in the interest of time. So the first, I think, relates to the issue of in situ upgrading and the fact that many of the patterns, especially in Cape Town, are based on the historical divide of, like, you know, a city that's quite spatially divided and spatially unequal. And in situ upgrading can very often reinforce some of those divisions that have historically existed during apartheid. So one of the key issues I think that needs to be kind of discussed and debated is how well-located land can be brought more centrally into the discussion. Not so much around in situ upgrading, but as a provision for housing delivery, particularly state-owned land. And that also has a very significant shift and probably recognizes the demand for both rental housing and rental tenure. The second piece is just around the issue of transitional housing. And we've been involved for the last 3 years in the transitional housing that was built in the city of Cape Town. And just to emphasize that very often some of these low-income models that get developed as pilots do not factor in the heavy operational costs of managing low-income rental housing processes. And generally, government institutions haven't done sufficiently well. In fact, even the private sector or the non-profit sector hasn't done significantly well in managing and maintaining and operating rental housing as a form of providing transitional housing or any other form of social housing. The third piece, just generally, I did feel that we kind of missed a little bit around the issue of community conflict and community aspirations. It seemed like there was a lot of discussion about typologies and planning instruments and operational systems and so on, but less so about what community aspirations and what community conflict and how that determines the outcomes of informal settlement upgrading. And just to state that there is a factual relationship and varying aspirations both within community residents themselves, but also between community residents and consultants in the state, and how many of these processes are negotiating those complexities of power and the relationships between those various structures. Thanks.
So it's perfect that now maybe Camila comes in from Sao Paulo, because she can share a little bit of very complex urban operation and financial frameworks that started with very, very strong conflict. Camila?
Thank you, Ana Claudia. Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations for all very interesting presentations. I'd like to take a step back and just for us to be on the same page to agree that we have informal settlements because we are unable to provide urbanized land to meet the demand. Yeah, that's something that we have in common in Brazil, in Brazilian cities, and what I have seen today. So in this sense, it's necessary to have a strategy to increase the provision of urbanized land. Otherwise, all the reurbanization initiatives will be like drying up the ice. To deal with that, in order to have enough urbanized land to meet the demand, Brazilian cities invented an instrument called ZEIs, which Danielle mentioned. ZEIs are social interest special zones. It's a legal framework which establishes something like inclusionary zoning. And it has two main goals, this instrument. First of all, the land is listed for social housing. So the main use that can be licensed in these areas is social housing. And the second thing that I think it's important for the South African context is that it sets special parameters. That is, we cannot think we'll meet the things like the minimum setbacks or the minimum size of housing using the standards that were set for the formal city. So that special zoning allows public intervention and the ability to put infrastructure and to provide new housings according to the context of informal settlements. Now, going to the financial mechanisms or financial alternatives, and using the Lincoln Institute motto, we can find answers to funding in land, using land value capture. But to do that, it's necessary to adopt a comprehensive approach to understand that both markets, formal and informal, are part of the problem. They are two sides of the same coin. So there are areas in the city able to support the densification. And why are these areas able to support this densification? Because there was investment, public investments in infrastructures in these areas. On the other hand, there are lots of areas that do not even have the basic infrastructure to support single-family homes. Based on this finding, on this idea, Brazil has invented a concept called created land. We call it solo criado. Under this concept is the idea that densifying in building higher should be compensated. So, and the payment of these compensations is what we use to invest in areas that lack infrastructure. Through this mechanism, which is the selling of air rights, we have been able to raise more than $2 billion in the last 10 or 15 years and make possible important investments in a sense of with the premise of redistribution. The conflictuous case that Ana Claudia mentioned is an informal settlement called Jardim Edite, which is inside an urban operation, which is a special area for intervention. And because it was a ZAIS, so we have both instruments working together. So the zonification for social housing, the ZAIS, which guarantees the right for the people living there to stay there, and the funding mechanism through the selling of air rights to pay for the urbanization project. So that's what I can add, I think, to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. Talking about financial frameworks, a lot was mentioned about the difficulties of aligned subsidies, grants, and public budget. Cess, you are on the call. Would you like to make some comments on that? Cess? No. Yes.
Hello.
Now you're talking.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Seth.
I was saying, can you come again with a question?
Yeah, lots of, Camila was just explaining about the financial framework, and a lot of the speakers, the presenters, mentioned the difficulties of align grants, subsidies, etc., right, to fund the different aspects of the project. So would you like to, coming from Treasury, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm sure I can come a little bit, but I'm sure there will be also comment that can come from the National Department of Human Settlements, because most of the housing finance instruments are sitting in that department. But before I comment, I would like to commend all the speakers that have presented today. I think we are beginning to see some innovation in regard to informal settlements upgrading. I was really, encouraged to see strong partnership developing, in the presentations that were made. Partnerships between the metropolitan municipalities and the communities, as well as, civil society, organizations. I think we will be able to scale upgrading citywide in our metros when we start to build those partnerships. And also the innovation basically in terms of the upgrading of informal settlements, because what I was also beginning to see, it was not just a business of putting pipes and toilets, and the focus also was around the issue of livelihood, projects, and also looking at issues of more economic, development as well. Which, coming now to your instruments, financial instruments, I am of the view that we do have a funding, structure within our human settlement sector that does not only cater, just for the conventional upgrading of pipes and waters, but that also responds, to the issue of livelihood strategies. As an example, the new informal settlements upgrading grant that is being, tested at the present moment, in its testing phase. It does not only, caters for just upgrading informal settlements physically, but it also makes provision to also deal with the issues of functional tenure. It also deals with the issues of community, partnerships and empowerment, as well as also dealing with the issues of livelihood, strategies as well. And so in a way, I'm not saying the instrument that is being proposed, it's perfect, but it does make provision for that. And we also got an urban development, grant, USDG, which is mainly at a city level. It's a supplemental grant, which is for the infrastructure, mainly, connector services as well as bulk services. But that structure as well as a supplemental grant and as also as an integrated grant, it also deals with the issue basically of economic development of social and economic, amenities. And so it's quite a flexible grant that is available, to the cities. And there is also, I think provincial government has also demonstrated that whilst upgrading is predominantly an upgrading of informal settlements program and also funded by an upgrading, a grant, but there is nothing that is stopping from government, from aligning that kind of a grant with human settlements development grant, which we call HSDG, which we're beginning to see that alignment, of grant, a USDG and HSDG happening at a, at a provincial, and city level. And what we have also not been very good, I think, as the cities and provinces in as far as upgrading of informal settlements, which has also been a work of a study that was done, I think, by DBME as well. We have not been very effective in using what we call the integrated development program, which means IRDP. nothing is stopping provinces, as far as I'm concerned, nothing is stopping municipalities from using that grant as part of an upgrading, a development program, in our city, which is basically more project-based and also encouraging, an integrated development, approach. I know that Ahmed has also been talking about the alignment of People's Housing Process program, into the, informal settlements upgrading program. And so all that I'm saying is that, yes, we do have diverse financial instruments. We do have diverse, programs that could really bring some innovation and integration into informal settlements upgrading, so that it's not just a business of putting, as I said, pipes as well as toilets, but we build more sustainable, communities through an integrated, funding mechanisms and program. As CSP, we have put a program management, upgrading toolkit. And one of the chapters in the toolkit that we have developed, it deals specifically with how do you start to be aligning and integrating the different, funding mechanisms to basically try to promote an integrated upgrading approach, in our city. And so that tool is available, to municipalities, to the cities, basically to help them to be able to structure, those financial strategies and mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ses. I think we are coming to the end. We still have one person from Latin America. Eva, are you there? Eva Campos from Guatemala. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, maybe you can share a little bit, just final comment about the experience of the city of Guatemala in setting up new standards, norms, and regulations to expand the supply of social housing. Shortly.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. I think we are in a point that we always ask how to advance without national legal frameworks, where the social value of the properties in the center. We think we must assume that the results will be limited, but we have to move on and do something from the city. And this point, we know that the land management instrument is the key, which allow the public actions to implement our process of improvement or renovations plan. We are trying to capture some capital gains and redistribute them to invest in informal settlement. This is a very long-term process, but in the middle of this point, we are also make some arrangement of the construction code and start to have a most active position from the municipality to encourage the social housing in the central zone in the city. I think the innovative approach from our city is that for the first time, the local government is assuming an active role because of the lack of the actions of the government, the central government. So we are assuming that through our regulations or instruments of land management, we can encourage, and also we are finding a way to make possible to build affordable housing. We think the dilemma is now we are only working to produce a new offer of housing. We are starting with that. Also, the dilemma is to seek some standards that guarantee hygiene and health, and also to improve the quality of life and have a solution that can be possible and affordable for people, a housing, and also be possible with a financial aspect. And we think the positive result for now is that for us, after a long time, we have a new project to be developed by private sector and regulated by the municipality. And for us to speak about 4,000 units, new units for social housing in the city is a huge number, because we have been stopped without any new offered new units for social housing. So we are learning and giving some step forward to show how to regulations and all the instruments of the city can encourage and show some results, important results, to provide new social housing. In this first step, are building by the private sector, and the municipality is taking the position to regulate and promote and put the setting all the conditions to develop these affordable units.
Thank you, Eva. Yeah, very clear the efforts from the city to expand the supply of social housing in a scenario out of subsidies and grants from and structured policies from the national government. So I believe we have to close now the debate. Thank you for all that provided input. We had a very intense exchange here over chat. Everything will be recorded and shared. So I will now invite Miriam Van Donk from Director at Isandla Institute for some concluding, for the final recap. Sorry, Miriam, are you still there?
I am still here, and I am reeling a little bit from the wealth of inputs and information that was shared. I'm going to try and just make a few comments about what I've heard, what stood out for me, and clearly what some of the points of conversations are going forward. But I leave the more clever closing comments to David, who will speak after me, because I'm sure he's got a better way of pulling some of this together than I do. I want to start off by perhaps just stating the obvious, because we often do this, but it may be worth saying this nonetheless. And that is that clearly what we've heard from the presentations is that context matters. What I think we haven't fully been able to explore today is how that context matters and how that informs what different possibilities and constraints may be experienced in the different examples that were presented today. One of the other things is that language and concepts matter. And it does seem to me that there are sometimes ways in which some of us use certain concepts or terminology, but we don't actually say the same thing. So we may need to be a little bit crisper with our language, and we may need to interrogate one another a little bit more clearly about what it is we're actually saying and what we mean when we say certain things. Maybe just not the best example, but one example is this concept of de-densification. And when that concept is used in other circles, we are told, no, don't use de-densification. It is not the right terminology to use, and others are very comfortable still using it. So I think we have to be clear and interrogate one another with what we mean. And then what is also coming through from the presentations, and I think particularly from the 3 South African examples, is that the underlying theory of change and ideology really is important, because that kind of starts to shift or make possible what some of the possibilities for change and the desired interventions may be. And of course, we're all concerned about improving the conditions of people who live in undignified, very often unbearable conditions. But what does that mean, and how we do it is obviously a point of difference. And I'm not even going to mention the role of politics and politicians and the emphasis on housing versus what may at times be the more complex, less visible processes of in situ upgrading that don't seem to provide the same rewards. Now, I'm not going to be able to do justice to the 4 projects that we've heard, or the debates that has happened, the inputs that were made, and the contributions in the chat. But just to kind of illustrate what stood out for me, in listening to the Kosovo example, it seemed to me to come from a place of kind of a radical imagination. So imagining a radical alternative, trying to connect the different pieces, the funding instruments, the programs, the institutional modalities, the regulations, the land question, and so forth, to then make this a possibility. And in that context, obviously highlighting some of the stumbling blocks and issues that need to be changed. Whereas if you look at the equine example, it seemed to be very much about, let's start with where we are and let's work with what we have. And from there, start to imagine slowly how we can change things over time by getting certain building blocks in place and addressing those fundamentals. The presentation from the city of Johannesburg was very much about a response to COVID-19. COVID-19 is here. It's forcing us to really consider the vulnerabilities in informal settlements very urgently. How do we respond to this? Whether one agrees with that response or not has come up in the debate. But it has clearly framed the presentation in that way. And very much a focus on dealing with the issue of density and associated vulnerabilities, and addressing kind of what many have referred to as more temporary ways of responding to that, with some questions around what the medium-term agenda is, both for those temporary areas and units, as well as for informal settlements where the majority of residents will still reside. I will pick up on the Phoenicia project as I go through the key themes that we've had, and I'll try and be quick. I think on the finance and financing, the key thing here that's come through, particularly from Pila, but also mentioned by others, is that there are multiple funding and financial instruments in South Africa responding to or enabling certain housing programs. But it at the same time also creates a certain disconnect and a high level of complexity and even rigidity in the system, because it's not easy to utilize the one instrument for another intervention, or for an intervention that tries to achieve multiple issues. We had a little bit of conversation around where the money comes from, what the money pays for, and whether the money is better spent in terms of the public realm or housing, or how you can potentially do both, and what's the sequence. And this is a particularly important conversation because we all recognize that public funds will be cut quite drastically in time to come. So there is no business as usual, if there ever was such a thing. But we clearly need to revisit even what was assumed and taken for granted as available funding and resources going forward. On the issue of land use and density and the social function of land, it's common sense, and it's said very often in these forums, that land is a key barrier and a factor that can significantly delay the incremental upgrading of informal settlements. But it's a queenie, although we didn't have time to really interrogate this, and I think that's a useful thing to take forward. It's a queenie clearly has a way, has worked around this particular issue of land. And as said, we don't have to wait till that's resolved before we start to improve the lives of people. The question I would pose is, at what point then does that issue come up? And at what point then can that become a possible stumbling block, or how can that be resolved? All case studies have spoken about the importance of improving tenure security, and I think Lauren's intervention and some of the chat on the sideline have been really helpful in crystallizing that a little bit more, so I'm not going to spend time on that now. What I do want to pick up on is this notion of density, and in a way, we often talk about density and how density is a particular factor of vulnerability in informal settlements, and particularly in the context of COVID-19. But I wonder if we shouldn't reframe it. and if the issue isn't more about overcrowding and underservicing. Because the density issue, as the Kosovo project is showing, can be addressed potentially in different ways. We can start to look at multi-story options. We don't have to relocate people necessarily, although there may be an element of that required for other reasons, but not because density in and of itself is the problem. And in fact, even if there is an element of relocation, vulnerabilities in informal settlements will still remain. So again, that would be the question to the city of Johannesburg. How will you address, not just in the immediate and emergency sense, the vulnerabilities in informal settlements by providing more water and sanitation on an interim basis, but how would you start to think about that in a medium to longer term perspective so that those are addressed? I'm going to just make two quick points around governance. I know I'm speaking for too long. The one critical point that I took away from the many very insightful contributions from the Phoenicia project in Bogota is this notion of learning by doing. And I think it was echoed by Faisal in the eThekwini example as well. We don't know all the answers. We don't necessarily know what's the right thing to do or how things will connect in the right way. We're learning by doing. And partly that process of learning by doing requires us to engage with different stakeholders, with citizens, with communities directly, because we don't know what we don't know, right? We need to engage others. And I think, again, the Bogota example in particular shows that very broad-based sense of engagement and consultation. And Faisal also indicated quite a number of engagements and platforms that eThekwini is involved in. I'm going to make two more points. The key points from the Bogota example, and Adi picked this up as well, is that the issue of resistance, contestation, and protest is central to this work. It's unavoidable. And I think in South Africa, there's often a sense where we want to think away any contestation and conflict, or we want to manage it at best or at worst. But the need for significant mediation, iterative engagement, consultation, and brokering of agreements came through very strongly. Because if you don't have those agreements, it's going to lead to contestation later on, the issues of ownership later on. And that also seems to be the basis for then bringing in the more powerful stakeholders, particularly the corporate and private sector, because your parameters of engagement and contribution have then been set. Perhaps the last point that I want to note is just about the value of this forum and for taking this forward. I think what this LAV has shown is, again, the value of learning across cities and even within cities with different stakeholders from within cities in South Africa, but also and importantly across continents and countries. Because we can, and I think in South Africa there are many opportunities for these stakeholders to talk to one another. But the point is, where does the critical interrogation and the challenge of our work come from? And sometimes we don't like it when it's another city or a national or provincial stakeholder who interrogates us, or a civil society actor, no matter how valid that contestation or critical interrogation may be. But I think that's where some of our contributors from other countries and other cities can really make a contribution. And I'm hoping that the next time we can frame the debate much more as that kind of critical engagement and interrogation, and really deepening the learning and the exchange amongst ourselves. So thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. This was amazing. So David, up to you now.
Thank you, Ana Claudia, and thank you very much, Miriam. I'm tempted to say agreed, and close the meeting, but I'll also cover a few issues. Maybe as a quick point to my South African colleagues is that on the 24th, we're having the emergency budget being presented by the Minister of Finance. And what that means is that a number of programs in the current business plans are going to be cut. To a large extent, some of them are going to be cut by over 80%. However, Cabinet has prioritized informal settlements upgrading as a key priority program, not to be touched and to be scaled up. So that's an opportunity for a number of us on this platform to make the loudest noise and start making immense contribution innovatively and using every platform possible to make a case for some of the good recommendations and suggestions coming out of this platform. So I just wanted to make that point. The themes that I really like to touch on is, one, the issue around land. Miriam has covered a number of this, so I'll just quickly raise bullet points. The land issue, there's a very stark difference between how the colleagues in the Latin America and in the South African context relate and approach upgrading as far as land is concerned. But I think the primary influencing factor is the location and the spatial configuration of informal settlements, mostly in the South African context. Informal settlements are in the periphery of the city centers, and the Latin America more or less in the inner city. So the approach around land and how land innovation and some of the policies have been crafted by our colleagues are very helpful, but also influenced by that configuration. The other issues around funding and financing. It came up with the presentation by the colleagues from the Western Cape, but beyond what Miriam has said, I would also want to echo what Seth says, that there's a variety of funding and grant structures beyond what human settlements grant funding provides. And also, it will be important that at some stage we need to look at how do we mix all these available funding resources to achieve a specific objective, particularly with respect to upgrading of informal settlements. One typical example is my favorite grant funding, Neighborhood Development Partnership Grant, which many people never consider as an integral part towards contributing to open spaces and other social amenities in the informal settlement space. So how you play around with the subsidy and funding regime in government in total, not only in the human settlement space, is something that might need to be looked at. The other issues around innovation, and particularly with respect to densification. All three presentations had designs, very interesting, colorful designs around how to densify and solve the issues of limiting relocation in favor of in situ upgrading, which is a very good case to make as far as densification is concerned. But it is important to also look broadly. As we come with innovative ways of densifying informal settlements, let's look at the broader land use management schemes in the country. How do you justify suburban settlement with 20 units per hectare? Next to it, you have 1,000 units per hectare. So those are some of the issues that needs to be looked at politically, but also from a policy point of view, whilst not arguing the fact that there's important needs to look into densifying settlements in lieu of the fact that land is also an issue. Miriam has touched on the issue of relocations, particularly around my concern on the terminology, decongesting, dedensification, decanting, and all of those things. It's important that we agree on the context and the terminology so that we know what do you mean when you refer to a particular program or a specific intervention. Then the other issue that came out very clearly from the three presentations, which I found very important, is planning informed by data and data acquired through locally based processes, data around the number of households, socioeconomic conditions and information, land size to determine the yield, all of that informing your ultimate product or ultimate design. It's a very good initiative, but also one of the points that Margarita raised it's around the whole focus through housing vis-a-vis the urban design. So that's one of the things in our USP program we might need to explore a little bit further. The other issue that has also come up was around norms and standards. And the question that arises is, was there an intention to have a temporary residential unit in an upgrading program? And if there was, then the norms and standards for TRAs becomes an issue. But if there isn't an intention, why make a provision for that? So in my opinion, when it comes to incremental upgrading of informal settlements, norms and standards are not designed for that program, but were predetermined and designed for formal housing and individual subsidy programs, whereas in an upgrading program, you use more or less a neighborhood approach vis-a-vis a single stand approach. The fifth point was around partnership, which has been covered extensively, but I was very impressed with the participatory processes by all the presentations, but more specifically, the Kosovo project, as well as the Bogota presentation, and the issues that were raised there were very, very, very critical for us to consider moving forward. And lastly, it's around how, because this focus is around cities, how do we make sure that collectively we start building capacity and a cadre of informal settlements practitioners that will participate in this platform meaningfully, because moreover, more and more, the same people, same faces are making inputs. It's important that we need to start looking into beyond the current cohort of people that are participating here. How do we filter capacity down to the actual practitioners in municipalities, as well as in the civil society, to make sure that whatever is being discussed here does get filtered in practice at the municipal level. Colleagues, those are the issues that I wanted to raise. And I'll then get to the last part of acknowledgements. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our colleagues from the Department of Human Settlements, the colleagues from the Cities Alliance. Both institutions have made these sessions a reality, and we really like to appreciate that. Thanks to Anna Claudia, who's consistently made sure that we are all on our toes and get to deliver as agreed, and these meetings sit as planned. We really, really appreciate that. Mark and Keisha for moderating a very difficult process. Virtual meetings are not as easy as we thought they would be, and there's still lots of learning to be done. Data, bandwidth, all of those things is part of what we will be learning moving forward. But I think we only 30 minutes out of our time, meaning you've done a very good job. Thanks, Amedi, for giving us that opening remarks and inputs. Monica always being our South African negotiator. Patricia Mana for managing the Zoom, and Patricia for ensuring that all the documents were distributed. Our colleagues who've made very valuable presentations from the Latin America, Bogota presentation, the Chile, the Guatemala, and the Brazilian, for you to wake up very early in the morning to spend time with us during this session is really appreciated, and we really appreciate the valuable input that you've made. And to our South African presenters, the preparation was very thorough. We really appreciate the sharing of 3 distinctly different presentations in design, in style, in content, aimed at one thing, upgrading of informal settlements. So we really would like to appreciate that. And all the partners that are at the bottom of your agenda, colleagues. I was going to mention you individually, however, due to time, all the partners that are involved in making this a reality. Thank you very much. And most of all, the participants, I've checked, the maximum number we reached was over 56 today, even though it has reduced toward 40. That's good participation, and it's a good start. And we hope that we'll get more and more engagements in the following engagements. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Apologies for the delay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
We'll come back.
Thank you.
We can actually make a picture, no?
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Thank you very much for all.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Camila, Eva.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Philippi, Lauren.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Fred.
Bye, everyone. Yeah.
Oh, I have to leave. Leave me.
Bye, Amity.